Now it's my pleasure to introduce Gwen Morgan. I see her popped up. Hi, Gwen. Let me tell you a little bit more about Gwen. She is a professional trainer of mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, with something called the Center for Mindfulness Studies in Toronto. And also, and we've had other speakers that are connected to the UC San Diego Mindfulness-Based Training Institute. For over 20 years, Gwen has facilitated many different kinds of workshops and practices, including mindful eating programs, which is interesting, in medical and community settings. And as part of the Center for Mindfulness Community Studies, she offers mindfulness programs for a variety of different audiences: marginalized people, psychiatric outpatients, youth at risk, and even training for frontline community workers, which I imagine everybody will agree is a very big priority, especially we've seen through the pandemic how vulnerable and challenging those frontline jobs can be. And so I think this is very important work. Gwen passionately believes, and you're going to get a sense of that, in mindfulness programs, and that how they will not only foster wellness and resilience in these difficult times, but also cultivate a caring community. She's going to lecture a little bit now about how her world changed a little bit, and practitioners like her. Of course, we all, in a different moment, we would have been in a room together enjoying each other's company and really engaging in this content. But we're still in a room, it's just a Zoom room. And that has really sort of affected the way that those sudden changes in the world, the way that she and her colleagues have integrated, but they took it on as a challenge and they've learned from it after more than a year online, co-creating with MBSR participants a deep and rich online experience of learning mindfulness. And Gwen's going to tell us more about that, and she's going to frame it through an acronym I love. It's CARE, C-A-R-E, connection, awareness, respect, and empathy. So with that, let's learn from Gwen Morgan. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm just going to share screen here.
Thank you. We need like hold music for when the screen shares.
Yeah, I know. There.
There you go.
Ken, you can.
We can see you. Yeah, we see the screen, and we hear you bright and clear. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to be here today to speak on teaching MBSR. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, which I really actually love, and specifically on what I've learned in teaching online over the past year of pandemic, social unrest, and a real calling for change. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I just want to briefly acknowledge the vision of Tita Angico and Dr. Patricia Rockman, who founded the Center for Mindfulness Studies in Toronto back in 2011. And right from the very beginning, particularly it was Tita's vision to include a community program. The community program is, I put it in the center here, it's funded by the clinical programs and our professional trainings, plus other grants. And the vision was to make mindfulness accessible to people and communities who face barriers of access. So here we are, January 2020, feels like a long time ago, right? We're all teaching in a physical room with real live bodies in front of us. And this is the CMS location in Parkdale, Toronto, a really lovely room to be in. And suddenly 2 months later, all of us are thrust into this new online world. And this was a shock for many of us. And for our participants, some of my participants dropped out of those first groups, opting not to move to the online forum, and hopeful for a quick resolution of the pandemic at that time. Hey, we'll see you in September, back live. Not. Months went by and we gradually realized that this was the new normal, teaching online. And we had started to master Zoom. But there was an issue right from the very beginning. How do we create a mindfulness or a meditative learning space online? It's really more than the room. But the intention was not just simply to master the tools of Zoom or maintain the fidelity of the MBSR protocol, although both of these aspects are important. But when teaching and learning mindfulness is so much about relationship, how will this translate into this artificial medium that capsulizes you into this little virtual box and in a time of imposed social isolation? So how do we balance technology with this intangible relational side of teaching? More importantly, how do we create a safe space? A space to build trust. And it's trust between ourselves as teachers and our participants, but also between participants in the group. And trust to be vulnerable to the process of learning mindfulness and opening to awareness as a path to healing. And the intention, I think, for all MBSR teachers is how do we capture the essence of teaching mindfulness? This quality that's often spoken about as presence or mindful presence. So there's been a lot written about presence, what it is, how it's expressed. And in their new book, our Center for Mindfulness Studies senior faculty, Susan Woods and Pat Rockman, they just published a book this year. So they define mindful presence this way. So presence is expressed as a dynamic and fluid attitude, demeanor, and behavior that involves a quality of focused attending, active listening, and manifestation of mindfulness. So behaviorally, focused attention on the here and now and using active listening skills, and involves demeanor, an ability to hold suffering with equanimity, in that same way that Andrea is just talking about. So equanimity, not indifference, and not here to rescue or fix, but with trust in our participants' inner strengths. And manifestation of mindfulness in presence arises when we are teaching from the ground of our own personal practice. And central to presence is the embodiment of the attitudes of mindfulness. And we're all familiar with John Kabat-Zinn's list: non-judgmental, non-striving, beginner's mind, letting go, allowing, patience, trust. And Woods and Rockman added curiosity and compassion. These are words that resonate with us as teachers, but how can one remember and reflect on a list of words when teaching? So for today's seminar, I framed these foundational attributes of mindful presence in this acronym CARE. So compassion, awareness, respect, and empathy. And within this acronym CARE, I'm going to speak to some of the ways I changed my online teaching over the year to create a greater sense of presence and connection. And I'm going to start with, okay, C, compassion. And I have a picture here of the Dalai Lama, as he's been one of the greatest influence and advocates for cultivating compassion. And there's other presenters who have spoken on compassion. So what I want to emphasize here is the action component in the definition of compassion. So compassion is not an emotion, and it's thought of as one of our basic motivational systems, because we are social beings that right from the very beginning, in infancy, our survival depends on others. So compassion is a fundamental human capacity. But Tumpa Jimpa of the Stanford University Compassion Institute, and he was a formal translator of the Dalai Lama, says compassion is here naturally, but it also requires conscious attention. It can be enhanced, it can be trained, it is a choice. Here, I'm not sure if that here, yeah, there it goes. I really like this definition. This is a quote from the Dalai Lama. You can read: when compassion arises, an inner door opens. And when the inner door opens, it's easier to reach out and connect with others. And I like this definition because it's hopeful, not only for society, but even on this micro level of teaching your group online. There's a call for practical, compassionate action. So I had a long list and I've synthesized some key points. And the first one I put under compassion was responsiveness, while still maintaining the MBSR protocol and integrity of this. So we transcribed our agenda for our live groups directly into the online format with, of course, adjustments in orientation. And as MBSR teachers, we know that in the live way of teaching, what we do is begin each session with a formal practice. And this is an important principle in teaching mindfulness: experience first, and inquiry, dialogue, teaching follows. And the intention here is to facilitate being fully present in the present moment and enhance experiential focus. But online, and especially in our community groups, the experience of this form or structure of teaching was distressing. It left people feeling vulnerable and disempowered. So by the summer of 2020, so we're a few months into the pandemic, our participants really let us know. And we changed. So what participants called for was an upfront explanation of what to expect in the session. So we now email out a brief outline of the session and the theme, and we spend 5 minutes at the beginning of class going over where we've been in the program and where we are going and what to expect. And we do an arriving practice, and there are other changes we made, which I'm going to speak to later. So this was really important for conveying a sense of empowerment to and responding to our participants in the context that we were, particularly last summer after George Floyd. So I put in here sensitivity to Zoom fatigue. This is something that went on over the year, particularly we're over a year into this. I changed personally to having a formal practice at the end of the session, 10 or 15 minutes. And particularly when we got to those sessions for and beyond, where we're really discussing stress, and I found that really helpful. Other colleagues have expanded the time from 2.5 hours to 3 hours online and allow more breaks. You can allow more opportunities for mini breaks. I'm inviting people to gaze away from the screen. And I have a colleague at UC San Diego, Valerie York Zimmerman, who embeds loving kindness meditation into every practice. So the beauty about MBSR, there's a protocol, but I always tell my mentees there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, and it was really called for here. And one thing, the third thing I put under here was verbal engagement. So chat is really well liked by teachers, MBSR teachers and my mentees for engagement, as the online groups tend to be a little quieter, and participants then have the option to type and chat. And that gives a nice feeling when you're teaching. However, chat use is a barrier to people who cannot type so quickly and for whom English is a second language. So I experimented with saying no chat and asking each participant to speak. And I asked them to speak in this view, the speaker view, to hear their voice. So I did this in session 4, and we invited each person to unmute and with their voice say what first comes to mind when they think of stress. Giving each person a voice turned out to be a very powerful felt experience in creating greater connection with the group, but also within the group. And also mindfulness is about connecting with self, and having a voice made a difference. So now the second part of care, awareness, A is for awareness. And I have a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. Awareness is like the sun. When it shines on things, they are transformed. And under this heading, I put again 3 things. So going back now to March 2020, the beginning of going online, of course, we changed the orientation session to incorporate a really fun and interactive way to teach participants the online platform. And at the Center for Mindfulness Studies, this was developed by Ria Plosker, who still runs a course on how to teach online. So this includes discussing online etiquette, confidentiality, the window of tolerance, and I also included an interactive discussion around group guidelines. I invited responses to the questions: what do you need from the group to feel safe? and what can you give to the group to create safety and trust. So now we're a year and a half into online teaching. Many people are familiar with online platforms, and there is a trend to combine session one and orientation, but I really recommend maintaining a separate orientation session. This gives times to talk about the online features. There's still some people that are uncomfortable, especially language or device. There can be different issues. It gives time to talk about the window of tolerance, which we've included as part of being more trauma sensitive. But a separate orientation allows time for building comfort also between group members. And this is foundational to building connection. I throw this one in, plan for glitches. They seem to happen. And what I tell my mentees is, tell your participants, you'll be trying to find your way back to them if everything goes black, and they found that really helpful. So that's a light thing I put in. And now also under awareness, as the year went on in particular. So it wasn't just being online, it's the context of this pandemic and all that we experienced collectively. There was really a call for greater awareness and greater responsiveness to diversity, to look deeply at implicit bias. This led to intentional changes for allowing greater inclusivity, ableism, using accommodations with movement, or transphobia, homophobia, having your pronoun in your Zoom name, which I think I didn't do today, but that's because I was a little freaked out presenting. And also awareness of race and cultural bias. And so one of my mentees told me, she said, MBSR teachers here, I guess like here in Canada, Ontario, you so easily mention the stress of Christmas, but you do not acknowledge other significant, equally fun, but stressful calendar events for other cultures. And she was from India, so she shared to me Uganda. I have to write them down, and Baisakhi, different holidays. So knowing the important religious and cultural dates and acknowledging these, this could be facilitated by changing up the intake form, and it can be couched in how there's both positive eustress as well as distress. But it's actually better to make this part of your verbal, your intake, your Zoom call intake, or your telephone intake. So just in general, allowing space and time for getting to know participants in the group, their intersectionalities, their individual needs, including how COVID is impacting loss of jobs. Are there elderly in the family? Who's been sick? Is the family here or far away? When was the last time you saw them? The isolation. This is all important. So when I was first thinking about the R in care, I was going to put down the word responsiveness. So it's a very important quality of mindfulness. But being deeply affected by what I was hearing, or we're all hearing in the news, the word respect came up. So it's an old-fashioned word. It's my grandmother's word, and perhaps it could have an authoritarian tone. But I was speaking to a colleague who's a school principal, and she said, but her high school students will say to her, yeah, well, I'll consider if I get some respect. So in respect, there's recognition. With respect, there is freedom to be yourself and accepted for who you are. It's being valiant. It's being listened to. So these are the changes that we made. And again, this was all in dialogue with our participants, plus our teacher trainings, and in the wider context. So we've integrated an inclusivity and land acknowledgement statement. And this was called for in the community groups, not at just the beginning of the program, but at every session. So that's part of our start now. The other thing they talked about was providing an open and easy way for participants to give feedback. or express concerns, perhaps separate from you as the teacher or me as the teacher. So we do open the virtual rooms a half hour early and a stay after, and participants do come in early and stay, or they, at the Center for Mindfulness Studies, they could phone the office, but this can be intimidating for people, especially if they don't really know the office staff. And when I worked at the family health team, the doctor provided another avenue for people to go, a trusted place for people to go for feedback. So we're still thinking this one through, but this has been asked of us. But one thing we can do is check in more often. We do have our halfway check-in with people. It's often written, and once again, it's much more accessible for most of our participants, particularly in community, to have a phone call to make this verbal. So formal and informal structures, intentionally reaching out to foster connection. So having the intention, following through. This was thing, knowing and acknowledging disturbing and tragic events at the beginning of a session. You know, what's happening in the news. It sounds really simple, but we as teachers are also working from home. Maybe we have kids studying at home, and, you know, we can get all caught up in busyness. However, the felt experience of some significant or disturbing or tragic event not being mentioned at the beginning of a session or acknowledged was profoundly erasing for people. So take the time to do the last minute check of the news. Better to clear your schedule a half hour, an hour ahead of time. And I've adopted even, you know, as part of the arrival practice, an acknowledgement of what's happening in the news. And we have to think also internationally. I teach in Toronto, where, you know, and in Scarborough, very diverse communities. So it's not just what's happening in Canada, it's what's happening elsewhere in the world. And sometimes this means squeezing other items on the agenda, but this is respect. This is respectfulness. So empathy. Empathy has a strong emotional component. It's a quality that makes us able to connect and feel concern, to care. It's not sympathy, it's not pity, which creates a disconnect between people. It's an openness and a willingness to be open to understanding, literally to stand in somebody else's shoes. Empathy is the emotion really underlying presence and being present and fostering presence. And of course, it's practiced through active listening. So I put top here, trusting the emergence of resilience. I mean, the whole way we teach in mindfulness from embodied presence really does support personal discovery and growth. And I'm often saying to my mentees or my participants in group, no right or wrong here, but increased understanding of how the ways that we are coping right now that might not be so helpful now are in place though for a reason. So embodied presence involves listening and being willing and able to be with whatever is emerging in the moment, including the pain of our participants, without fixing it. And I think you've got a sense from listening to Andrea of why this is so important in mindfulness. And it's really just being present, or presence is the way. So more and longer breakout rooms. This is like some technical things I throw in here too, because when we first started online, we were allowing 1 breakout room per session and 3 in a room and making it fairly short. And the rationale behind this was concerning the sense of safety and how to be trauma sensitive online. But as the year went on, you know, I experimented with adding in more breakout room experiences, making them longer with some groups, depending on the sense of the group, moving to dyads. The feedback in general from participants was that breakout rooms were the best part of the online experience. They got to actively connect with others in the group. So providing this opportunity. And then I put self-compassion in difficult times to prevent burnout. So this is really great following Andrea's talk, because empathy has these 2 components, emotional and cognitive. And empathy can lead to emotional overload, overwhelm, draining, or burnout. And the literature actually tells us there is no compassion fatigue, there is empathy fatigue. And of course, if you end up in burnout, you're not emotionally available for your participants, and nor do you have the perspective or energy needed for compassionate action, for really being there, for listening. So the cultivation of self-compassion can be protective of empathy, burnout. So please include yourself in this circle of care. So I just want to touch on inquiry. Woods and Rockman describe inquiry, which MBSR teachers will understand what I mean by this. After we do a practice, we have a process where we're investigating the experience. What do we notice? What happens when we brought awareness to it? And how might this be relevant in life? Inquiry is an embodied mindful presence in speech. So inquiry is really at the heart of teaching MBSR, whether live or online. And our mentees devote a considerable amount of time and effort to learning how to do inquiry. And Dr. Rockman offers a 2-day workshop on inquiry and advanced training, which we all support her in. And inquiry is a practice. It's a mindfulness practice. And essentially, we're teaching the process of inquiry as we engage in inquiry as an embodied mindful presence. We are supporting our participants to learn and know that they can be present. They have the capacity to hold their pain, to stay with the difficulty, to discover, tap into their own inner resources and choose a wiser path to self-care. So in this talk, I've shared some of the changes that I made over the past year in teaching MBSR online in this wider context of pandemic, social pain and fragmentation, and the cry from diverse communities to be heard and seen. And I've offered this acronym CARE as a way to capture and to remember our deeper intention to teach from and out of mindful presence. So pausing before your online class, taking a breath and bringing to mind care. If we can remember care, compassion, awareness, respect, empathy as a means for cultivating presence and connection online, and when we go back to in-person groups, because we'll be different also going back to in-person, then we can really answer the call for healing in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Wonderful presentation and some really, you learned a lot. And,
Yes.
and it seems like it wasn't just a burden, it improved your practice and the way you teach,
Yeah.
which is terrific.
Yeah.
Can I add just one question before we go? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Is there any way this experience online with all its challenges, has it improved your teaching and your students' learning in some way? Is there some special thing that happened, even with the constrictions of being in this square box, that makes you a better practitioner, but also a contributor to their learning?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest learning was, first of all, with some of the, like, I went into some of the technical thing, longer rooms and things, but the real actually learning came from the participants and the mentees in training and listening, like hearing this call. And Ken, I think I'm pretty aware. I was, in the demonstrations back in 1968, and I was part of the Committee Against Racism in the 1970s, and I still learned more. I learned more. I was open to listening. There was call to listening. I responded and we changed up. And I think that we don't need to be afraid of this. We need to embrace this. And I feel deeper connection with all my participants, with my mentees, and I really do. With the groups in the community, we responded to them. Absolutely, they learned more in a space that became more their space. And if it's really about fostering resilience, that's where it is. You got to be where the people are coming from.
Meet them where they're at. Thank you, Gwen. That was really powerful. We really appreciate your contribution today. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.